All right, everybody, happy Friday. By my clock, it is 12:15, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started today. This is Sam, your host for our sixth and final webinar in our grazing series. The series has been a partnership that was sponsored by Northeast SARE grant among the Hashemi Lab, Masood Hashemi at UMass, Heather Darby at UVM, and Rick Kersbergen of UMaine. It's also in partnership with the Livestock Institute and funding from the Cedar Tree Foundation, which is a part of the recently formed New England Grazing Network. And you can find more about the New England Grazing Network at our website, our Facebook, or at Instagram. So as you saw on my home slide, I'm coming to you remotely today from a cabin in Maine, which is great, but I'm a little nervous about my internet connection. So Arthur from the Hashemi Lab is also on, and if anything goes down, he'll take over as your host today. So I want to give Kathy plenty of time to talk. I'm really excited for her content today. So Dr. Kathy Soder is an animal scientist with USDA ARS, and there she is a part of the Pasture Systems and Watershed Management Unit. Kathy specifically is a part of research that looks at how forage characteristics such as species diversity and physical and chemical characteristics affect animal intake, productivity, and quality. And when we were talking about this webinar series and picking our different topics, at the end we came, and we said, are we missing anything? And we thought, yeah, we are absolutely missing something. We really wanted to get someone who could talk about the animal product, the animal health as a result of some of these different alternative forages. And Rick Kersberg recommended Kathy, and I don't think they could have picked a better recommendation. I'm really excited for the content that she is going to share with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Kathy, I'm going to set you to the presenter, and whenever you are ready, you can take it away.
All right, show my screen. All right. You tell me when you can see my first slide.
We can see it.
Okay, you can see and hear me, so we're good to go. All right, well, Sam, thanks for that introduction. I can skip that part, and so we'll jump right into our topic today. Alternative forages have gained a lot of interest with grazers for many reasons, including climate change, increased feed prices, and specialty milk and meat markets like organic and grain-fed. There are still many unanswered questions regarding these forages, and today I'd like to review some research that does exist, some of it ours, some of it I've collected from some other folks, particularly in relation to animal performance. The information is quite limited, but there is a little bit out there that I was able to put together, and we will work with what we have. So when we're coping with climate change or variable climates, weather patterns have changed all around the world. We need forages that can adapt to that change. A lot of my references, unless I specifically mention some other studies, will be towards the northeastern US. And we've been getting longer periods of heat and drought in the summertime, and this tends to depress growth in our traditional perennial cool season grass pastures. There's also more emphasis on soil health and more natural resistance to disease and pests. We're also looking for options to plant when either renovating pastures, switching crops, such as to give a field a break when you're going to replant alfalfa or something like that, to improve soil health, or simply to fill a gap, keep the soil covered, and produce additional feed until the next crop can be planted. We've also been dealing with a lot of economic uncertainty as farmers, and this has resulted in looking for ways to either decrease costs, especially feed costs, since there's such a high percentage of total cost in an animal operation, including through grazing, to capitalize on value-added markets such as the organic or grass-fed, or to diversify income on the farm by adding another enterprise. So if we take a look at our grazing annual forages, where do they fit in? So we're trying to bridge that gap between where the cool season forages fail us. So if we take a look at the growth pattern of our cool season forages, we get a really nice flush of it April, May, June, and then when it gets hot and dry in July and August, our cool season grasses tend to stop growing. And then we get another smaller flush in the fall. But what about this summer gap and then the either end of those periods when these forages are not growing? We can fill in these gaps with forages such as warm season annuals. They take off about the time the other forages are slowing down in growth and peak during those hot, dry times. So they can provide a lot of forage, some of it very nutritional, depending on type and maturity during those periods. And we can also take these cool season annuals, whether they be the small grains, brassicas, and whatnot, to bookend the cool season perennials to extend the grazing season both in early spring and late fall. This will help reduce feed costs throughout the year by reducing the need for harvested costs and also help meet minimum pasture requirements for some of our specialty markets. So if we have annuals, what are some of the advantages of them? They're very quick growing. They fill in those gaps in forages as we just discussed. They're grazable sometimes within 40 or 60 days of planting, high yielding, high quality. Many of them are drought tolerant, and they can graze or be harvested for silage, baleage, grain, or seed, depending on which ones you select. But like all things, there's cons as well. They needed to be planted annually. It could be using land that could be planted into perennials where you don't need to plant annually. You do need to look at timing of precipitation. If you look at the Northeast, particularly us right now, planting forages of any type this August would have been terrible because we have had absolutely no rain whatsoever. There is a cost to this. They are quick maturing. Some of them, there's a real short window that you can graze them before they get too mature. They're management intensive, and some of them do have some toxicity issues. So what are we talking about when we're talking about annual forages? Well, some of the most common ones are the brassicas. And they can be planted in the springtime for summer grazing, or they can be planted in the summer for fall grazing. They can be planted as a monoculture or mixed in a cover crop mixture. They hold forage quality quite well into the cold, frosty weather and have added benefits for soil health, such as mining minerals to the surface and helping with soil compaction. There's also warm season annuals. Some of the ones that are growing in interest around this region and our region is tough grass, pearl millet, and sorghum Sudan grass. Planted in early summer in my region in central Pennsylvania, that would be around early June, and provide copious amounts of forage during the summer weather. And there's also the cool season annual grasses. Annual ryegrass is probably our staple, but you can also have triticale and many of the small grains, wheat, oats, barley, and the like. And they can be planted when another crop, such as corn silage, is harvested to provide a cover crop and late season grazing. Some of these will even overwinter and provide early spring grazing. So I'm not going to go through everything on these forages because there's a lot of things we know. The nutritive value can be quite high on these. For a lot of them, like the brassicas, they should be limit fed, not just turned out into a field because of the very low fiber, high nutritional content. We recommend strip grazing, and you almost have to treat them like a concentrate, provide another source of fiber, whether it's another pasture or forage in the barn. The cool seasons do maintain quality after frost, and there's a lot of methane production by ruminants, particularly with the brassicas by feeding them, and there's a lot of interest in that. But there are health and toxicity issues. You can get bloat from grazing them. Brassicas can cause goiter, which is an iodine deficiency. And then with our warm seasons and well-fertilized small grains, we can also have nitrate issues either during drought, anytime there's stress, drought or frost. But the big question is, what about possible off-flavors in meat and milk and animal production? Again, there's a lot that is not known, but I did find some studies, and we have done a few studies looking at some of these issues that I would like to review for you. So the first study, and a lot of these do come out of the South when we're talking about warm season grasses or trying to look at cool seasons down there as well. So this one's out of Alabama. And so they looked at 3 different types of forages, mixtures, triticale plus annual ryegrass, wheat plus annual ryegrass, or the combination of wheat and triticale and annual ryegrass. These were a 2-year study, continuously grazed beef steers, and they had 4 tester animals that they used for production in each paddock, and they would have had replication of that, so it wasn't just 4 animals per treatment. And they would put and take steers as necessary to maintain stocking density based on forage growth. So if we look at mean seasonal forage mass, forage allowance,
Grazing days per hectare, some of this is in metric, which we can convert, and stocking density. The forage mass was not different because of the put and take. They maintained it that way on purpose because they did not want to confound that with their other results. The target allowance for forage was of 1 kilogram of dry matter per kilogram of body weight was actually 10% less. They were looking for about 2.5 pounds of dry matter per pound of body weight. But there were no differences in any parameter in treatment or year. So the grazing days were less than that of some other studies that are published, but these used larger animals, and so that's why grazing days were less. You'd have to put it on a per pound basis, which would help make it more equitable. If we look at the nutritional value of the forages, the crude protein exceeded the requirement for these steers, gaining about 2.5 pounds per day. There was no difference in fiber or lignin content by year or by treatment. And if you look at the in vitro dry matter digestibility, it was quite high. So this is where I say, even with the fiber, the digestibility is very high. So they're getting a lot of nutritional value out of this, and can really do some growing on it. When we break it down to the so what factor, there really were no differences among treatments or between years. The final body weight averaged, I did convert this to pounds, about 1,180 pounds. Average daily gain was 3.2 pounds per day. And the gain per acre averaged 492 pounds. And whoops, I'm sorry. And the average, let me go back to that. The average cost of gain was around $3.10 per pound of body weight. So there was a slightly greater cost for the triticale treatments for both of them, and this was most likely due to the cost of the seed. So another study also in the South, this one out of Arkansas. Historically, there's been a lot of small grain establishments, and what they looked at in this study is it was two 4-year grazing studies of continuously grazed forages. In their first experiment, they had wheat, and they had different treatments, tillages. Conventional tillage, which was the moldboard plow, a reduced tillage where they just kind of scratched the surface but didn't go as deep, and then there was a no-till treatment. And they had 3 different stocking rates of about 3/4, 1, and 1.5 steers per acre if that's converted. In the second study, they looked at wheat plus annual ryegrass, and their treatment was whether they used synthetic nitrogen fertilizer or white clover to provide nitrogen. So if we look at the effective tillage system on grazing days and gain per hectare, the little modified or no tillage resulted in greater gains per hectare than conventional tillage, say greater. Less disturbance of the soil and soil aggregates, which may have impacted the microbial population of the soil, may have resulted in greater forage yield and quality. This was not measured directly in this study, but it very well could be. When you are disturbing the soil less, there was a lot of still root structure and soil aggregates for growth. The higher stocking rate resulted in greater grazing days and gains per hectare throughout the season, resulting in greater overall grazing days and gains. So this higher stocking rate, this is probably due to greater utilization of the forage. There was less trampling, more competition, as in this lower stocking rate. Again, remember, this was all continuously grazed. So those lower stocking rates were probably trampling a lot more of that forage. So if you did some strip grazing with them rather than continuous grazing, these results may have differed. There was a significant interaction between stocking rate, which is in the left-hand column, and tillage, which is across the top, tillage method, with the highest stocking rate, along with the no-till, resulting in the greatest gain per hectare. Again, this probably goes back to some of these factors we mentioned before. The no-till probably allowed more of the soil aggregate to remain, more of the microbial activity, and then again, forage utilization at the higher stocking rate. When comparing the use of planting white clover with nitrogen fertilizer, grazing days, whoops, I missed one there. Grazing days, which is actually above here, grazing days were greater in the fall with the nitrogen fertilizer. This was probably because the clover had not yet developed enough to produce those nodules that fix nitrogen, so they probably weren't
active nitrogen fixer at that point. But if we look at average daily gain and grazing days in the spring after the plants had overwintered, the clover had a benefit there. There were more grazing days, but average daily gain was lower. This could have been related to forage quality compared to the nitrogen fertilization because you get a quicker bang for your buck with the nitrogen fertilization. But what we need to take a look at is also looking at economics of these issues. Planting clover with the grasses resulted in lower pasture cost of gain, dollars per kilogram here, and greater net return than using the fertilizer. Again, this probably goes back to the cost of the fertilizer. The fertilizer gave a quicker bang for the buck with growth, but in the long term, even though these are annuals being planted to clover, did have a better net return, although the gains were a little bit, I'm sorry, the pasture cost of gain was a little bit higher. So you have to balance that. Your mileage may vary depending on your cost of fertilizer, what you have available, but fertilizer costs sure don't seem to be going down. If we switch a little bit and go into some warm season annual systems, again, another study from the South, because this is where these are coming from. This study was conducted in Georgia. The forages in this study were sorghum Sudan grass, a brown midrib sorghum Sudan grass, pearl millet, or pearl millet plus crabgrass. And some people may say crabgrass, but there are people interested in it. It is a good warm season annual, and there was interest in trying it. So they had a 3-year grazing study. They had 2 tester animals per paddock for each sub paddock, and they did another put and take to keep the stocking density where it needed to be to match forage growth. So if we take a look at the weather patterns, they're going to, of course, be higher than they are here. If we look at 28 degrees Celsius, this is about 82 degrees to 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and about 0.8 inches to 7 inches up at the top for rainfall for the month. So you can see there was a lot of variability throughout the years. And this is an important factor to keep in mind as we go into these results of all these studies, that environment or weather during that season, particular season, may be more important than the variety. But in general, you can see like in 2016, they had lower precipitation and higher temperatures. They had a hot drought. And if you look at 2014, they had higher rainfall and lower temperatures. So pretty typical for different years, but there was quite a range in these environmental variables. So for pre-grazing forage mass, there's 2 important points here that I'd like to emphasize. The forage yield, if you look at these, the 3 that did not have the crabgrass had higher forage yield during week 0, and also it translated throughout the season for quite a ways, because the crabgrass probably just started slower and it has a lower yield starting at the beginning. The sorghum Sudan grass, because these are the 2 treatments with the sorghum Sudan grass, one with brown midrib, one was not, outcompeted or outperformed the pearl millet as you got into the growing season and you got 6 weeks into the trial. But what was significant was there were some treatment effects, but year was much more significant than treatment. And if you think back to the weather patterns that I showed you, that would be a big indicator of why we saw these results. And because of the extreme droughts they had during the 1 year and a very low temperature, high moisture event. So environment just plays such a significant impact on how these results may be interpreted. If we look at body weight, average daily gain, and carcass quality, there were significant year effects again, but no treatment effects. No effects on final body weight, hog carcass weight, average daily gain, or grade of the carcass. So again, years having a much greater impact than the actual forage that was used. So that was the results of that study. I have another one. I'm going to jump back to a cool season study that was done up at the University of New Hampshire. I've done a lot of collaborative work with them, with brassicas, and there are several postdocs and graduate students of mine and at UNH that have been involved. Currently, Luis Silva is a graduate student under Dr. Andre Brito at University of New Hampshire, who conducted this collaborative study looking at canola as a grazing forage in their dairy herd. So the objective of this study was to look at canola. So we wanted to evaluate the effect of canola as a grazing resource on milk yield, and we were also interested in enteric methane emissions in dairy cows. The two studies were conducted in the falls of 2018 and 2019. Cows were divided into two groups. The control was fed and kept indoors. I'll show you the diet in a second. And the canola group was fed indoors during the day and then strip grazed canola during the night. In both studies, we used a diet with 60% forage and 40% concentrate. The difference here was that in the first year, we included 30% canola, and in the second year, we had 40% canola in the diet. We were able to increase the percentages based on the first year results and also having a little bit more land available the next year. The two canola pasture fields were divided into strips to provide a daily herbage allowance of 26.5 pounds of dry matter per cow the first year and 42 pounds per cow the second year. The canola was increased in the diet, well, again, as I said, based on the results of the first year and land availability. The cows also had continuous access to two green feed units. Those are kind of neat units. You can see the one on the left was used in the barn, and the one on the right was on pasture. And the cow has its head in, it's basically what it looks like as a mineral feeder. And the unit will sample the breath of the cow and analyze the gases on the spot, and it can be transmitted back to a computer or a smartphone. So we can do almost not a continuous, but a multiple sampling per day. There's a feed bin in there that gives the cows a little bit of a treat, which is what brings them into the unit. And as long as they stay for a minute or two, we can get a methane measurement off of them. So our results are preliminary and still being analyzed, but despite low dry matter content, the canola had greater crude protein. You can see it was in the mid to high 20s for the most part, whereas the baleage was about 18–19%. Very low fibers. The NDF on the canola was 14 to 17%, depending on the year and at which field. Extremely low, extremely loose stools when you feed too much of this, which is one reason I said it needs to be treated almost like a concentrate. So it was very low fiber, very low lignin as well. But you can see that the sugar content, as we look at ethanol soluble carbohydrates and non-fiber carbohydrates, were quite high and a lot higher than the baleage. The biomass was greater during the second year, which is in the right-hand graph, probably because we're able to seed 2 weeks earlier, so we just got better growth on it, and it may have been the year effect as well. The average harvest efficiency was around 30%, so there was a lot of wastage on it. You can see in the foreground of that picture, there's quite a few stems and leaves, and if you look straight down, there's a lot of trampled leaves, but the cows were consuming quite a bit of it as it was, and we were getting about a 30% efficiency on it, or utilization on that. As planned, the cows in the canola group here ate about 30% less in the first study because we wanted them to consume about 30% of their intake on the canola and 40% the second year as predicted. So they were pretty close to that. The estimated total dry matter intake was similar between the canola and control in the second study, but in the first study, cows in the canola group ate 5 pounds less. So not quite sure why. We're still trying to figure out why that might have happened. It might have been an effect of the forage quality. It might have been what they were feeding in the barn, quality of the forage there, or the feeds, or the type of feeds, but a little bit different. But in the second year, there was no real difference in dry matter intake. But that lower intake that first year did result in decreased milk production during that first year. You can see it was 49 versus 45 pounds of milk. But fat-corrected milk and energy-corrected milk were similar between those two groups. Milk fat percentages was not different and was over 5%. These were Jersey cows, so the milk fat will be higher, so we did not have a milk fat depression. Milk protein percent was higher in the canola, but the yield was similar in both years. Lactose and solids non-fat were lower for the canola group in the first year, and milk urea nitrogens were higher in the cows fed canola in the first year, probably due to the higher protein and protein solubility in the canola, but at the same time, these were not excessively high MUNs. They are well within the range or on the high end of a fairly normal range, so we were doing a pretty good job of balancing that protein in the barn with some lower protein forages and feeds. If we take a look at the gas measurements, there was no difference in oxygen and carbon dioxide production, but we were really interested in the methane production. And it was lower in the canola group as well in total production, as well as the intensity, the concentration of it. The decrease was even higher in the second study, which had a greater inclusion of canola. So you can see it was decreased by 25%. But we don't know yet if this reduction in methane is due to active compounds such as the glucosinolates that are found in brassicas, or if it's just a better nutritional composition of the canola herbage because there was more canola in the diet during that second year. So the conclusions of that study, that canola does have the potential to be used for grazing during the fall season, and the cause of the reduction in methane emission still needs to be investigated. We did have, fairly decent milk production compared to the control diet, but we do need to account for things, you're grazing them, strip grazing them, and watching for goiter or supplementing with iodized salt so that they get an iodized source. But there are limitations. It was very hard to establish with no-till, which is what we were trying. This was also in an organic system, so we weren't able to burn down the previous forage with Roundup. So if we're using a no-till, we were basically overgrazing or overclipping it and then seeding into that. After grazing canola, it's too late to establish any cover crops, so you're not going to have another crop beyond that. And there was a lot of pasture management because you're moving the fence daily with the strip grazing. So the question too is the effect of alternative forages on meat and milk quality. You hear about Offflavors in meat, milk, or milk products such as cheeses. There's a very limited database source out there on this topic, and really there is no definitive answer. The research is limited and contradictory. I found some studies from Europe and from the US looking at Offflavors in cheese, for example, and where I could find one study that said no effect, another study would say yes, there was an effect on it. So it's really hard to tell. I just think there's other hanging process that's affecting flavors. There could be other feeds that are being fed with these animals. It could be the level of the secondary compounds, such as glucosinolates, which will vary by environment as well as variety and type of forage when you're talking about things like brassicas. But the common parameters are often to say to withdraw animals from these brassicas in particular 4 hours before milking, put them on another forage or bring them to the barn. And if you have beef or lamb or goats, pull them off and put them on another forage for 7 to 10 days prior to slaughter. And this will kind of wash out any of the Offflavors that may be present. I wanted to finish up a little bit. I've got some slides here on some ongoing research that we're doing. I don't have results at this point because these are research projects that are happening right now, but I think it's some interesting things to look at regarding some of these alternative forages and what we're trying to do with them. So our first project was looking at grazing annual ryegrass that we interseeded into standing corn. And the objective is to extend the forage production and grazing season through the utilization of harvested or grazed winter annuals and corn residue. And the idea is that we plant these annuals, we've used both cereal rye and annual ryegrass, into the standing corn, harvest the corn as grain. And when you harvest corn as grain, you're talking about October, November. You can't get a crop established at that point because it's too late in the season. If we could have a crop standing underneath that when this corn is harvested, it can grow and then be utilized either as let it alone as a cover crop, you might be able to harvest it, or you might be able to graze it. So where this idea came from is some earlier work done at Penn State University showed that when you had corn yield in the y-axis and cover crop biomass in the spring on the x-axis, when they had no cover crop or they put an interseeded cover crop in of red clover, annual ryegrass, or a combination of the two, you can see that you had an increase in yield, both corn yield and biomass, especially when you had the combination of clover and ryegrass. And so that got us thinking about what we might want to do there, looking at it from a more practical standpoint. And so when we did it just with ryegrass to start with, because it was A, higher than red clover, and B, we didn't want to confound effects. Are we getting an effect from a red clover or ryegrass? So we decided to just go with the grass to start with. So our experimental design is at the Rock Springs Farm outside of Penn State University. We used 102-day corn. We have gotten into some more short season corn since then, which has helped our project a lot. This has been going on for 5 or 6 years. We planted at 26,000 plants per acre, and the annual ryegrass was interseeded at 25 pounds per acre. And we had 2 locations on the site, and they do have some differing soil quality and water holding capacity, and we do see some differing results between the 2 of them. So the ryegrass is planted at the V4 or V5 stage, about when the corn's knee high. As well, so we can be combined early season. So we want to get this interseeded. And this is an interseeder that was developed at Penn State, basically no-till drill that has been modified, and we can get it right in between the rows. And we want to do it before the corn gets too high so that we aren't hurting the corn. We can do a side dress fertilization along with that for the corn, but then that's the last we'll be in the corn for the rest of the season. So to look at some of the early results, I do have a few results, but we're ranging in corn yield from about 120 to 150 bushels per acre. And if we look at the total forage availability, this would be the corn residue after harvest plus the ryegrass. We're looking at, if we had 100% utilization, we'd have almost 5,000 pounds of dry matter per acre, down to 50% utilization, about 2,500 pounds of dry matter per acre. That's a lot of dry matter standing out there that could be used for grazing or left alone to increase organic matter and keep the soil covered. If we look at just the ryegrass availability without the corn stover, we're looking at about 1,750 pounds at 100% utilization, down to about 875 pounds with 50% utilization. So there is a potential for extending the grazing season. If we look at an assumption of a 65% utilization, which was that middle number there, you know, if we had 132 days per animal unit per acre at 2.5% body weight consumption, we'd be talking about some type of a dry cow, if it's dairy, or a beef cow. So if we had a herd of 30 beef cows, 1,200 pounds each, they could graze 73 days on 20 acres with 65% utilization, or 55 days on 20 acres with 50% utilization. So that's another 2.5 months of feed for those animals that could be utilized at a much lower cost than feeding harvested feeds during that time. So a little bit on the fertility management. After the corn is removed, which is usually late October, early November, maybe a little bit earlier this year, we manage the interseeded crop as a forage crop. There is nitrogen applied at that time, and we're putting on about 50, 60 pounds of nitrogen when the weather's warm enough for optimal ryegrass growth. And we do get quite a bit of growth after the corn is harvested, because the ryegrass has been shaded out nearly all summer. And once you get that sun down to it, even in the late autumn, it will grow. So you have to think about, how will this fit into my operation? You have to consider a lot of things. If you're putting this in the cornfields, you're going to have fence put up. And if that's permanent fence, that may hinder corn planting and corn harvest. We, at our location, because we're required to, we do temporary fence. It has to be put up and taken down every year. You need to consider the ability to remove livestock during bad weather, because there's typically little to no shelter out there. You're in the middle of a cornfield. So you can have an animal in a soil hazard. If it gets too wet, you have a lot of compaction. You have to consider your water supply. We don't have permanent water to those animals. We take it out in the back of a truck. But what if it gets too cold to freeze up? Do you have electricity to keep water open to them, or how will you do that? We've had some issues with that. Would additional fertilizer help? We've considered that, and we may make some changes in the future, but we can't make too many changes too quick, or we can't compare results from year to year. There could be some acreage to spread manure in the late fall. When you take that corn off, you could spread manure on that ryegrass to help it grow. This may help keep your animals out of confinement or sacrifice a lot longer into the season, along with providing high quality, lower cost feed. But you have to consider, are my animals adapted? The first year we did this, we used some dairy heifers that were adapted to grazing, but they were not adapted to utilizing corn stover, and they did not know what those corn ears were on the ground. They ate the ryegrass to the ground, but they did not touch any of the corn, the stover or the ears. They actually lost weight on that project, which we weren't happy about. So then we switched to a beef herd that was accustomed to grazing corn in the wintertime, and the difference was just astronomical. Those cows knew what to do, went right in and cleaned up all that corn and cleaned up the grass, and the adaptation is a very important part. So a lot of people, does it pay? Well, if you're looking at fencing, it's going to depend. If you're looking at permanent fencing, you might be talking about a couple $100 an acre. Temporary fencing would be less than that, but it depends on what your needs are and what your labor requirements are. And the ryegrass may cost about, for 20 acres, about $600. Power maybe a couple $100, depending on, especially if you're heating water. So in year one, we looked at about a $5,000 cost. Now, the fencing will be divided over years, so it was depreciated over years. So that wasn't all factored into the first year, but if you only do it 1 year, or if you're purchasing it and doing it, it depends on how you want to do your economics and your finances. But if we looked at grass hay, so the cost was $5,000 even with the fencing the first year. If we'd have fed the same amount of hay during that time, or fed hay during that same amount of time, it would cost us $7,500. Plus, we would have had manure to haul out of the barnyard because of them being in confinement somewhere, unless you had them out in the pasture with hay bales. But it's just a factor to consider that it might pay. So again, this is an ongoing long-term research because we're doing the same corn in the same field. This is to see if we can keep corn yields up through replacing nutrients with the ryegrass and the manure from the cows, rather than going into a rotation, because there are a lot of folks who like to put the corn back in the same field, but again, not rotating crops can be detrimental to yields and to the soils. So hopefully we'll have more results from this in the future, but at this time, that's what we have on this project. The second ongoing study that we're conducting is interseeding warm season annual grasses into perennial cool pasture. And we want to determine if interseeding of warm seasonal grasses will provide significant increase in biomass, availability, and quality over just a pure cool season perennial sward during the summer months. So what we did is we took orchard grass monocultures, we seeded those, and then we're interseeding these warm seasons into them. So we have the orchard grass monoculture and then a monoculture of each of the 3 warm seasons, the sorghum sudan grass, pearl millet, and the tough grass. And then we have them interseeded as well, orchard grass and sorghum sudan, orchard grass, pearl millet, orchard grass, and tough. So the orchard grass was just planted in fall of last year, and we planted the warm seasons, we interseeded them and with no-till drill into the orchard grass in June of 2020. We're harvesting at 5, 10, and 15 weeks of growth, looking at regrowth as well as if you just let it go and grazed it once, for yield, quality, and botanical separations. We are just coming up on our first 15-week harvest, so we don't have any full season data yet, and we're going to repeat this for 3 years. So that's all I really have on that study, because it's so new. But we want to really see if we can do that, because we have a lot of people who are landlocked and want to get more forage off the same land. And if we could take these orchard grass pastures when they're not growing in the middle of summer and put something else on there without significantly impacting survivability of the orchard grass forage, but get more grazing out of it, I think that would be beneficial for a lot of people. So we have a lot of testing to do with this yet, and then of course putting it to the animals at some point, because these are just forage plots right now. So I want to talk briefly on some future forage needs or research needs that are needed in this area. We need more studies that maximize animal performance and nutrient management. Animal studies are just not easy or cheap to conduct, and I think it's going to take some time, but we want to get some more studies out there looking at animal performance. How do we deal with future weather extremes? These patterns keep changing. Will they continue to change, or will we settle into a new pattern? That's the million-dollar question. Looking at forage mixtures, we're doing a lot with monocultures. You have to walk before you can run. We want to get going with some mixtures after that, looking at the diversity and benefits of that. Economics of contract grazing, farming animals out onto other land to graze. Forage-based finishing systems. With the grass-fed market, meat and milk market taking off, we really need to have more information for these folks on feeding and finishing these meat animals as well as the milk production system. We need long-term effects of grazing these cover crops and subsequent row crops. What happens year after year after year? We don't have enough data on that. And of course, more on warm season annuals. So I just wanted to finish up with acknowledgement to a lot of collaborations and input from data. Some of my former postdocs have been involved with this and provided a lot of the data. They're off and on to other careers now. We've gotten some funding for these projects, hoping to get more. But I know there's a lot of questions still remaining out there about managing animals on these types of systems. We don't always have the answer, but I'm always happy to hear the questions and see what kind of questions we can answer. So with that, I will stop and take any questions. And there's my contact information if anybody has a question later on. If I can't answer it, I'll try to help find somebody who can help get you an answer. So I will turn it back to our host.
Hi, this is Sam. I'm having a little bit of a connection issue, but I think I'm back. So if I go down again, though, I'll ask Arthur. So here, a few questions. One is, are there particular issues of transition to pasture from stored feed for small ruminants that are different to cattle?
Truthfully, the issues are very similar. You're changing a diet, whether it's a small one, they're all ruminants. You're changing a diet, so you need to do it in increments. You need to, the best information I can give you is to fill them up on some good quality hay before you turn them out the first time, and let's say in the springtime. Turn them out for a short period. Sometimes you can set up net fence or some temporary fence if they're really, really hard to get in, or you don't have a good herding dog for the small ruminants in particular, so you can round them up again. Only let them out. I like to let mine out. I raise sheep at home. I like to let mine out for the first time on a nice sunny day in the middle of the day, because when they're going to get hot, they're not going to graze as heavily. They're already full and lazy. They don't want to graze in the middle of the day, so they're not going to graze as hard, and the grass will be dry. You don't want to send them out on wet grass for those first few times. So maybe the first time you send them out for an hour or two, next day fill them up on hay and send them out for 3 or 4 hours, and you keep increasing it until they're out. So it really does not differ with a small rumen. It's just a transition, because that rumen's going to take 7 to 10 days to totally transition to a new diet. So you don't want to overload them, especially with that really lush spring grass in the early grazing season. Good question.
Another question, did the warm season grasses grow which were interseeded into the orchard grass?
They did. Like I said, I don't have data on, because the data has just been collected in the last 10 weeks, and we still have it in computers in raw form. It did grow. We've got some pictures of it coming up through. What the yields are, I don't know yet. Check back with me next year. Sorry, I don't have that information, but that's why we're doing the research. We want to know.
That'll be a good part 2 follow-up.
Yeah.
When renovating pasture by rotating animals through overgrown and weedy pasture to force them to eat down overgrowth, what percentage of that pasture would you recommend be a part of a maintenance versus a lactating animal's diet?
Well, if you're talking really overgrown pastures, like mature hayfield pastures, I wouldn't recommend that for a lactating animal, period. If you want to fill them out with something decent in the barn and then just turn them out to munch on what they want, they can do that, but they're not going to utilize much of it. And if they are, I mean, think about feeding an athlete straw or celery. You're going to fill them up, but there's not going to be a lot of nutrients in it. For maintenance, for if you have good condition, dry beef cows or ewes or does or anything, or dry cows, dry dairy cows, you can put them out on something like that. Watch their condition, watch their rumen fill. See what they're doing. They'll talk to you about it. They'll tell you whether they're refusing it. I probably personally, if you want to maintain some growth, I wouldn't make them eat much more than 30, 40, maybe 50% of it. They'll tell you. And then you may want to clip it afterwards to get that regrowth started again. Because if they're leaving the seed heads, a lot of times a plant won't start regrowing if it still has seed heads attached. Once a plant does that, throws seed heads, a lot of them senesce, they stop growing until the whole system is reset through harvest or grazing.
Great, and we have one more right now. So if anybody that's on has a question, get it in now so we don't close down and miss you. So Kathy, last question for the moment is, would you recommend getting a feed quality test for new alternative forages, or would you just graze them and observe?
I always recommend forage quality tests, eat for pastures, for anything. Now, I realize that some of it may not come back until after you've already grazed it, but if you're going to do this from year to year, it may help you diagnose problems. If you had problems in your animals, you may be able to tie it back to something in nutritional value. It will also give you a baseline of okay, I was mixing this ration or feeding them this corn or soybean or something in the barn, and they were grazing this. Their stool was too loose. Maybe it was too much protein in the diet once I calculated out, and I need to give them more fiber, less protein. Take the soybean out or something like that. I think there's a lot of value in it. When you're talking about perennial pastures, I like to tell people, let's do a spring, summer, fall of pastures that are very different. Get a seasonal average over several years, and that will help you kind of start eyeballing things. And then watch the animals. Are the rumens full or are the rumens not real full? Are they chewing cud? That's a good sign of rumen health. Are they full? Are they producing? Are they growing? Are they milking? Are they, whatever your indicator is of health and growth. You kind of have to watch the animals, but there isn't an absolute percentage. But yeah, they can go out and clean it up. It's going to depend on your class of animal.
Great. So, Kathy, it looks like that might be all for now. So if you are on the call today, or if you're someone listening to this later on the recording and you come up with a question, please get in touch with that. We know Kathy's email is on the screen here, and I think a lot of people know how to get in touch with me through those registration emails. So with that, Kathy, thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this today. It's really interesting to hear what's coming around the bend, and it sounds like there's going to be a lot of great information coming for us on the feed and the productivity of these alternative forages. So thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you. And it was great to have everybody here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. All right, everybody, I'm going to shut it down. Have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend.